I'm sure if you're one of my students, you're always asking what's possibly coming next that could be even better than what we did today. Okay, well, anything. But today we're going to be talking about what comes next, succession. So the thing is, globally nowadays, we cannot escape human influences. This is always a reality. We need to understand the connection between these human influences and the ecological processes that already exist and how they're really interconnected, because even in polar regions you find the chemicals that we produce. So this is all really important. If you take a look here, you can clearly see there's a gap in the forest of sorts. You can see that there's this trail that goes through, this paved trail, and you can tell that people have mowed this area as well. And to understand that a little bit better, we really need to get into the idea of ecological succession. So this over there, a little further out, is a little scrubby. Right next to me, there's some very artificial lawn. And over here, some edge habitat, the edge of a forest. Ecological succession is how a community changes over time. I'd like to equate that to evolution being a change in the population's DNA over time. We can talk about population dynamics as being how populations change over time too. Well, this is the way a community structure can clearly change over time. Let's talk about it in more detail. We differentiate between two types of ecological succession: primary succession and secondary succession. Primary succession means you start with no life. You may think like this paved path. However, under the paved path, there are seeds. And you can even see there's some cracks in the path there, and there's some vegetation that pops up through it. Let's zoom in on that as I walk. Same idea, right? That where did those come from? Well, the seeds could have been blown into the cracks, or actually very likely as well, there were seeds underneath it the whole time. So for primary succession to happen, you need to kill everything off. Like lava would do that. We're just having rock and starting with rock. So nothing else alive, nothing alive. Rock is not alive, sorry. But that would be primary succession. So this is not an example of primary succession. With primary succession, how do you get life there? Well, the pioneer species come, things like lichens and moss can break down rock. And then you can get early successional species. And we could start talking about them here. Now, if you could see the yellow warbler that went across there, but pretty bird. Anyway, so we need to talk about soil and we need to talk about vegetation, because really everything else follows. The soil quality leads to differences in vegetation, which leads to a more biodiverse habitat, which leads to the animals that wind up being able to live there. Over here, you see a very scrubby, not very natural area. Not very natural because we're just in a municipal park that has fields, and you can even see the lights up there, I think. Anyway, so what would happen after the lichens and the moss would come in and start to break down the rock is you start to form some soil. If you really think about what soil is, it starts with the minerals, and then it gets into the organic matter. And once there's enough of that, there's a whole bunch of light, just like there is here. It's really sunny. And you get early successional species like goldenrod and, some of the things like grasses that might start to grow. And you can see these smaller plants, they need a lot of light in order to grow. They might not need the best soil quality, and they can disperse pretty quickly. And that's why they can get to an area and kind of take it over. But then if you look behind it, there's some larger plants, and we'll talk about that next. All right, so once you have these very light dependent grasses and goldenrods and things that can come over and take over the area, these early successional species that can grow clonally often and also disperse their seeds pretty far, and this way they can grow on these soils that are not that great. Then you get things that can grow in better quality soils. Why? Because as these plants die, they put organic material into the soil, and that's often the limiting factor. You need nitrogen and stuff for a lot of the other plants to start growing. So some legumes might come in and add some nitrogen to the soil, and then you get larger plants that are more shade tolerant because they can grow starting in the bottom here. If you have something like, this multiflora rose is there, it's an edge species, but you have these trees that are growing there. I see a cherry tree in the back. They're more shade tolerant. They can grow up right next to these grasses and early successional species, and they can actually outcompete them for the light, and eventually they'll die out and they'll become more of a forest, especially if there's a forest close by for the seeds to get there to be able to disperse into that area. You can see there's an oak tree right there and a whole bunch of other trees, including some black walnut and many other species. Anyway, and some grapes. I just plant them out just for fun. But once they get going, they're adding even more organic material into the soil, and eventually you do get a larger forest in this area. That's what you would get. In order for it to stay a grassland, you need fire or disturbance or something that would knock out and not allow those larger trees to get going. If we had pine trees in the area and the soil never really got that great organically with the organic matter, that could last a while until the organic matter gets going, and then deciduous trees would take that over too. That's why you often get pine trees in rocky or sandier soil, because they can survive there, whereas these deciduous trees cannot. So what is it about ecological succession? To change. It continues to change. Just like evolution, there is really no end point. It is dynamic. So at this point, this area may tend towards being a deciduous forest eventually, unless we manage it for grassland like they are kind of doing here, but not really, honestly. But there's no end point. We used to have a climax community idea, like, oh, this is the end. Well, no, there's no end. There is more vegetative complexity often as we increase in time. There is better soil quality and less light at ground level. Those are the major changes that happen over time, and you can illustrate that graphically as well, and that often is done on exams, for example. It's a good way to depict what goes on over time. And you could also throw in the idea of facilitation and inhibition and tolerance if you want. But this is what it looks like in real life. And to understand what to do with that from a management concern is you have to understand that these things will change, that the soil quality is really what leads to the vegetation, which again is going to dictate what animals can be there too. So as you think about what's going on in this area, you'd know that if you were to mow it like they did there, eventually it's going to turn back into that and then into that. But if you leave it alone, I doubt they're going to leave that area alone from what I'm looking at. And from my standpoint, I get here's something that happens quite often. Human use is important. It's a park, right? You want the open space. This also at least was a good place for grassland species like grasshopper sparrows. They were breeding here. Didn't hear one today. They might still be here across the road, for example, but they wouldn't be in this because there's not enough grass. But if you leave it unmowed, it will get back to that. If you decide instead you want to use this for a picnic area, you could. And like I said, being this late in the season, I'm thinking they're probably going to leave it this way, but I don't know. I don't know the plans. I do know if it was me and I was concerned about grasshopper sparrows, I would have done this at a different time of year if this is just mowing it to make sure it stays a grassland. It's a little late in the year for mowing. You'd want to do it before they come back in the spring. But anyway, just one management concern that you'd have to think about in terms of succession.